What if the thing standing in front of you is the very thing God will use to show what He's placed inside of you? This is the story of David and Goliath. Welcome to the Valley of Elah. Right over that ridge is the Philistine army. And down there is the camp of Israel. David came from Bethlehem, not as a soldier, not as a commander, but as a shepherd boy bringing food to his brothers. He didn't know it yet, but this ordinary trip was about to become a moment everyone would remember. Before David ever faced Goliath, he knew what it felt like to be overlooked. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house, David's older brothers were brought forward, one by one, strong, confident, impressive. But David wasn't even in the room. He was outside in the fields, watching the sheep. And that is where God had been preparing him, in the quiet places. No one else was watching. Down in the valley, a warrior named Goliath stepped forward every day. He was bigger, louder, and stronger than anyone expected. And when he shouted, the soldiers of Israel stepped back. But Goliath was more than just a giant. He sounded like fear. He sounded like doubt. He sounded like that voice that says, "You can't do this." And for 40 days, everyone listened. Then David arrived at the camp, not with a sword, not with armor, but with bread for his brothers. He was only there to help, but as he stepped into the camp, he heard the same voice everyone else had been hearing. Goliath shouted across the valley again, and the soldiers pulled back. But David didn't hear an impossible problem. He heard a challenge against the living God. When King Saul heard that David was willing to face Goliath, he tried to help the only way he knew how. He gave David his armor, a helmet, a sword, and heavy battle gear made for a king. But there was one problem. David couldn't move like David anymore. So he took it off. David wasn't being careless. He remembered how God had already helped him in the fields. And he knew he didn't need to pretend to be someone else. Saul's armor looked important. It looked powerful. It looked like the kind of thing a warrior would need. But sometimes what people think matters most isn't what God is planning to use. God had already been preparing David, and he had already placed what David needed in his hands. So David went down to the stream. He didn't carry royal armor. He didn't carry a soldier's sword. He carried what God had already taught him to use: a sling, a shepherd's pouch, and faith in the living God. David picked up 5 smooth stones, not because the stones were powerful, but because God was. And sometimes, the thing that looks small in your hand is exactly what God is going to use. David stepped onto the battle line. Goliath was still there. The soldiers were still watching. And yes, David may have felt fear, but his faith was stronger than his fear. because David believed something everyone else had forgotten. The living God was greater than the giant. This was not a boy showing off with a sling. This was not a toy against a warrior. David was trusting the ruler of the universe to show Israel, the Philistines, and Goliath himself who the real champion was. So David moved forward. He drew back the sling with the skill God had already taught him, stepped into the throw, and released the stone. For one quiet moment, everything seemed to stop. Then the giant fell, and the valley saw that the battle belonged to the Lord. David was not the champion because he was stronger than Goliath. David trusted the true champion, the living God. And that is what faith does. Faith does not pretend fear is gone. Faith remembers that God is greater than the fear. So when you face something that feels too big for you, remember David, and remember the God who was bigger than the giant.